Hello, good morning, and welcome to today's training session. My name is Daniel Oba, Head of Innovation at Flowlease Nigeria Limited, a licensed data protection compliance organization. Today's training is very strategic and important because, as Chief Information Security Officers, it is good you understand the risk your organization will likely face when you onboard a third party. And from recent happenings globally, to be precise, with Cloudflare, which experienced global outage between November 15th and 19th, and also December 5th, 2025, it is now very important for organizations to be strategic while onboarding third party. Now, Cloudflare is not the only organization who we are going to be looking at. We also have AWS, which is Amazon Web Service. There was also a global outage on the 20th of October 2025. Also, Google on June 12, 2025 experienced a global outage, and this affected services across different platforms from education to banking to airline systems. So we need to understand that third parties pose significant risk, but what is most important is the fourth party risk many organizations may not be aware of. And that will take us to introduce today's topic, which is strategic third party and supply chain cyber risk management. Feel free to drop your questions on the chat box. We'll take our time to address every question in the course of today's training. So, what do we call third parties? Third parties are organizations that could be vendors, suppliers, service providers, or partners that have a direct contractual relationship with your organization. So let us take it home. Take, for example, a financial institution like a microfinance bank. They will depend on third parties to provide them certain services like banking application, call centers, marketing, cloud service solutions, and even manage IT services. Now, these third parties will be having access to your data, and these third parties will pose significant risk if not well managed. But what is most important is the entities you may not be aware of that are also privileged to have access to your organization data. And as a CISO, one of the things you must understand is to be able to allow top management understand the risk factors that may lead to ransomware, phishing, or social engineering attack. There are different types of risk we'll be looking at when it comes to third party integration. One of those is reputational risk. If a vendor experiences a cyber attack or handles data in a way and manner that leads to data breach, it will have a negative impact on your own organization because you are the primary entity the data subject has a business relationship with. Also, you also look at the regulatory and compliance risk. Take, for example, businesses in Nigeria that handle the data of Europeans will not just comply with the NDP Act 2023, they also have to look at the GDPR. So if you depend on a third party that is not compliant with the GDPR, though you operate in Nigeria, you will be seen as also non-compliant. Not to talk about organizations that process card on your behalf that may not have a PCI DSS certificate or may not have gone through an ISO 2701 audit. So those are regulatory and compliance risks those third parties may pose to your organization. Let us look at the operational risk. Now, there could be service outage or business disruption, which will also lead to loss of business income. So, as a CISO, making management understand all these risk factors will help you to onboard the right vendors, having categorized them based on their risk threshold. Also, not to leave out the data protection and privacy risk. if they have weak controls, they may also be handling data and storing it abroad. That will lead to cross-border data transfer risk if they don't handle it appropriately, or they store this data in countries that are not whitelisted by the NDPC. So your third-party vendors will pose significant risk, and we need to be able to address those risks before they lead to reputational issues, fines, or penalties. So if you have questions, you are free to drop it. We'll try our best to answer as much questions as we can handle in the course of today's session. So handling third-party risk is easier than the fourth-party risk because ideally you should have an SLA, a service level agreement with the third party. And this SLA most times have clauses that allows you to be able to audit their processes and enforce some certain certifications prior to being onboarded. So third-party risk have some metrics to minimize the impact that will pose to your system. However, fourth party risk is different because when you talk about your fourth party, you're looking at your vendor's vendor. And not every organization may be aware of their vendor's vendor. So these third parties you may have engaged in the past may have subcontractors. They may also have service providers that provide them maybe with software as a service, platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service. So let's look at a fintech, for example. They may also use multiple API to be able to integrate analytics, payments, and KYC. And if you use their platform, you may not also be 100% aware of some of the fourth party vendors. And if those fourth party vendors experience any form of cybersecurity risk, it will also affect your service, which may lead to downtime or fraudulent transactions being carried out on your platform. So you ought to know from day one if your third party will be engaging other entities and what will be the level of engagement. Will they have access to personal data? Will they have access to sensitive data? Or will they just be able to have access to data sets that have been anonymized? So some of the risks we'll be looking at when we talk about the fourth party risk is the hidden cybersecurity risk. These may be vulnerabilities that exist on the fourth party system that by virtue of integration comes into your third party and your third party provides a solution that is already having such vulnerabilities. So for example, a KYC platform may be using an outdated plugin, but you are using that to communicate with your customers, right? To be able to profile potential customers before creating an account for them. So while you use such platforms with outdated plugin, that will also pose significant risk to your infrastructure. Though you may not even be aware because you primarily know the third party, but this fourth party who provides them a platform will now pose risk to your own infrastructure. We also have things like jurisdictional risk when a data controller or a data processor handles data and store this data in countries that don't have adequate legislations when it comes to handling personal data. That could also pose risk to your infrastructure. And some entities may not have competence in handling data breach. That could lead to reporting after the 72 hours period. That could also lead to concealing data breaches, which may at the end of the day affect your own compliance metrics. So other scenarios that could play out is the data lineage risk, whereby because you are not even aware, this data set is not part of your record of processing activities because you don't even know what kind of data is handled, what kind of data is stored, and this can also lead to you being seen as non-compliant because you are not aware of your detailed record of processing activities. So fourth party risk is harder to manage compared to third party risk because you don't have a direct contract or enforcement right with this fourth party entity. Also, you may not be aware, and there will be limited disclosures from the fourth party to you. And most times, you only discover this fourth party when there is a cyber attack or an incident that requires you to be able to be aware that it is not just your third party who is responsible for handling personal data. So, looking at what we've been able to discuss so far, you would understand why it is important as a CISO that you understand all fourth parties that by virtue of business relationship that exist within your infrastructure should also be compliant with certain metrics, certain regulations, so that your data remains secured at all time, whether the data is on transit or whether the data is at rest. So as a CISO, it goes beyond submitting your CBN report. It goes beyond doing awareness training for staff. You have to look at your third parties, look at your fourth parties, and see where are the compliance gap and how can we fix it within the shortest possible time. So once again, if you have questions, drop on the chat box. We are compiling the questions and we'll take our time to address each question. So let us look at some practical risk management approach for third-party risk. One of the most compliant metrics is classifying your vendors. And a lot of organizations do this in order to mitigate compliance risk, which is good. You should know a vendor that is critical. You should know a vendor that will pose a high risk. You should also know a vendor that will also have little or no risk because they don't handle any sensitive or personal data. Because not every vendor can comply with all the requirements when you look at the data protection, the cyber security, the risk management framework. Because not every vendor will handle personal data, not every vendor will handle sensitive data. So if you don't classify your vendors, you may pay more attention to people that will not pose significant risk because their brand are not well known. And for those whose brand are well known, you may overlook some of those gaps that ordinarily they ought to have complied with. So we'll go through some of this risk management approach for managing third party risk and also talk about the risk management approach for the fourth party. So for fourth party risk, it is always good that you advise your vendor to disclose all subcontractors. When you onboard a vendor, one of the key questions you should ask is, do we have subcontractors or entities or individual who by virtue of this business relationship will be critical in meeting some of our goals? Where are they located? And what security measures like encryption could be implemented to reduce data breach? You should also look at subcontractors that will handle critical services, because if you don't take that into cognizance, you may also find out that your third party doesn't have a backup. They rely on the fourth party. And that will also be a risk if you have downtime, ransomware attack, or a cybersecurity risk. And while conducting incident response simulations, always look at the fourth party. Don't just depend on the third party being compliant, meeting certain metrics. What about the fourth parties? Can we have a simulation that also take into cognizance the fact that they are also vital in our data flow? So these are critical elements every CISO should understand and implement in order to forestall risk. When Cloudflare had the downtime, a lot of organizations thought they were being attacked. Little did they know that it was a downtime from Cloudflare, but because their website, their applications were built on that, they got the error message. And that was a big risk because imagine if you had a critical service and you're experiencing downtime, you don't have any backup, there's no server that is acting as an alternate at that particular point. Then you can't make income as a business. You've lost customer trust. You have reputational issues. And that's not your fault. It's the fault of a fourth party, not even your own third party. So third party risk is what you contractually manage. The fourth party risk is what you inherit, and often that will hurt you more because you have little or no control in terms of managing it. So let's look at vendor risk classification based on data sensitivity, system access, and business criticality. Majorly, when you want to classify vendors, you may look at their business criticality. So for a finance institution, a third party providing you core banking will be more important than somebody who is coming to maintain your air condition or maintain your office equipment, because your core banking vendor brings in funds, manage your customers, and that is the heartbeat of the business. So you don't expect your core banking vendor to have the same compliance metrics with the guy who is just coming in to do routine maintenance as a freelancer. So if you don't classify your vendors, you may classify them as doing the same, having the same risk, and not putting priority where it's most important. So for the purpose of this class, we'll look at data sensitivity, network access, and business criticality as key elements in classifying vendors. So now, let us say we are looking at data sensitivity. In previous sessions, we've had to define what data sensitivity is, but just to bring us home to what we've been able to do so far, let us look at the major data categories that an organization should ideally have. So we have the public and non-sensitive information. These are things that could be on your website because they are public facing, right? When they don't have any login credential to access, such as your marketing content, your public report. So that would be regarded as a low risk because it is public, it's already in the public domain. So imagine if your marketing content is photocopied and kept in a public space, it's already on your website. So the impact will be low. It's not as if it's a confidential or trademarked document. Then you have your internal category, which have staff emails and internal memo. So that will be seen as medium. And you have personal data that have customers' name, customers' email, BVN, NIN, and all those sensitive data sets that may not primarily be seen as sensitive but are critical. Then you have the core sensitive data like health related information, biometrics. This will be seen as what? Very high. So the key question you should ask is, if this data is breached, what is the regulatory, financial, and reputational impact? If it's going to be very high, if it's going to be high, if it's going to be medium, or if it's going to be low, that should tell you the category that that data should be what having. Then let's look at network access. Now, some vendors may have no system access. Maybe they come in, do their routine maintenance. They don't have any login credential to your IT infrastructure. So they don't have any system access. Maybe they just sign their personal name on a booklet or your visitor management app and they log in. Then they have vendors that will have limited access, maybe to your web portal, your software, and these are already role based. So it is already limited to some extent. But because they have access, we can put them under the medium category. Then we have technical vendors who may have access to your back end and connect through VPN to your system. I may also have co-admin rights because they developed the platform. Then you have the integrated and persistent access because they are always connected to your platform, like a KYC platform, for example. It has to be running 24 hours, 7 days a week. So we'll see that as a very high threshold, right? Then we have business criticality. Now, there are some vendors that can create disruptions. There are some that will create inconvenience. There are some that will create major business interruption, and there are some that will have regulatory impact. So, if you can answer this key question, which is can the business operate safely and legally without this vendor? Then you know how important that vendor is. A bank, for example, will not be able to operate without an internet service provider. They will not be able to operate without their software vendors, either cloud solutions, KYC verification. So that already tells you that this vendor is critical. So you pay more compliance attention to such vendors. So under the classification model, a tier one vendor will be seen as handling critical data. And it means they also have privileged system access and they will also be able to have access to sensitive data. And what does this mean? It means they are very important. And the risk they will pose on your system is also high. So you should look at making sure that they do what is called a data privacy impact assessment on their platforms. And where applicable, they could share this report with your team. Also, vulnerability and penetration tests will be mandatory for such vendors. And trainings, cybersecurity training, data protection training, risk assessment training will also be something you want to verify they do annually. Good examples of such vendors would be payment processors, cloud hosting providers, trading systems for stock brokerage firms. You could also be depending on a platform to carry out stock trading. So this poses significant risk and such vendors should be well managed. Then we have the tier two vendors. These vendors may have access to personal data, but not as much as the tier one vendors. So you also want to carry out security and privacy assessment on their platform. You want to be sure that you have contractual data protection clauses with them that talks about data sovereignty and what happens to the data after the business relationship. And that's where you have your SLAs. Such vendors could be your HRO platform, your CRM platform, your payroll platform. And you also need to know that assessing them should be something that should be consistent with emerging laws. Take, for example, the NDPC introduced the GAID. you also need to look at what does that say for vendors. Do they have key compliance risk? If they do, what are those risks? So how can organizations address those risks? So you implement some of those things that such regulations or guideline have talked about. Then we have the tier three vendors. These handle limited data and will not pose critical operational disruption, such as marketing agencies, training platform. Training platform primarily may have your staff details, your staff email, and your staff phone number, but they may not connect to your system. There are also collaboration tools that will also have limited access. So assessing them annually is good, but you could also prioritize the tier one and tier two for annual assessment and look at assessing them between 2 to 3 years. But that also has to look at what your information security policy says about addressing such vendors. But because they don't handle critical data, you could also reduce the compliance they are to meet when compared with tier one and tier two. But if you have enough staff and you have the right infrastructure, you could also put them on the same scale. But to be able to meet up your compliance goal by prioritizing key vendors, it is always good that the tier one and tier two vendors are given more attention so they don't pose risk that will affect your business, which will not lead to business interruption, and that will also lead to financial loss. Then we have the tier four vendors who will likely pose little or no risk. You have people who are event planners, office supply, and vendors. Maybe they provide you with staple pins, paper, maybe content creators. So they don't have key data sets that will lead to business interruption. So you could give them basic documentation to fill. You could ask them to conduct audits with the NDPC, and once that is done, that could also be a compliance matrix to judge their risk factor. But you also keep your eyes on them in case they migrate from tier four down to tier three, down to tier two because of business relationship. So we'll also look at some of the reputational consequences of third-party data breach. But we'll start with the regulatory consequence. Now, when you operate in a well-regulated sector like finance, there are different regulatory bodies that will be interested in your business meeting certain compliance threshold. You could have Security and Exchange Commission, you could have the NDPC, you could have NITDA, you could have CBN, you could have NFIU. All these regulatory body would have certain things you have to do consistently. So when you outsource a service to a third party, it doesn't exonerate your business if something goes wrong. So if you fail in any of this area just because you outsource a certain service, the regulatory body will still hold you accountable. So you are 100% accountable for any non-compliance, irrespective of the fact that you may have outsourced it to a third party to perform. And that may lead to regulatory investigation. Last year, the NDPC published some data controllers of major importance that failed to comply with some provisions of the Nigeria Data Protection Act. That posed a reputational issue. But let's assume that data controller had engaged a company. Nobody is going to ask you to come and explain that in the newspaper, right? They just believe you did not comply. So you want to also make sure that such third parties don't pose significant risks to your business. And such infringement may lead to administrative fines and penalties. You could be suspended, you could be asked to pay a fine, and those things affect your online mileage as a business. Because when someone wants to do business with your company, they put your name on Google. If they see your name on a sanction list, it creates, can I continue this business? That kind of scenario. Are these people trusted? Why are they on the list? What other entity can I contact so that I have an option? So you don't want to be in such scenario as a business, and you should avoid such actions. So once you engage a third party, know they could pose issues like reputational issues, and you also want to address those things from the onset by categorizing these vendors and making sure they meet certain threshold when it comes to compliance. Now, some third parties may not report data breach to you. And looking at the CBN law that says you should report cybersecurity risks within 24 hours, and the Data Protection Act that says you should also report data breach within 72 hours, there may be an overlap if a vendor fails to notify you on time. So you need to also know that if a vendor delays communication, that is not an excuse. You ought to be proactive as the primary entity. So let's look at the most common reputational consequence, which is brand damage and loss of trust. Some companies have had to rebrand after significant cyber attack because they lost customer confidence, they had a negative media, and that also led to some of their management leaving the company. So you want to be proactive and you want to avoid issues that will lead to negative media when it comes to your brand. So handle your social media well and ensure that third party vendors do the right thing. And they also notify you if they have a fourth party in that business relationship. So your board could also be scrutinized by a regulatory body that may lead to emergency board meeting. And as a CISO, you are going to take the heat because they will have somebody to blame. And most times it falls on the CISO's table. So as a CISO, go beyond your day-to-day technical compliance, governance, and risk management job schedule. Look at those risks that have not been addressed over the years and build a roadmap to address this risk. You could escalate this to top management and let there be an evidence this was escalated. So when the trouble comes, you have some form of safety net. Now, customers generally would not want to work with a brand that has gone through cyber attack or negative media publicity. And you want to ensure that that is not you or your business. So don't lose your competitive advantage. Try as much as possible to keep base with your third parties, your fourth parties. As a CISO, you should know the CISOs in those third parties and build relationship with them so that the work you've been assigned with can be done effectively. So a third party breach is ultimately judged as a governance failure. It is not usually seen as an external accident. So as a CISO, in order to forestall management seeing you as incompetent, try as much as possible to address both the third party risk and the fourth party risk as fast as possible. So we're going to go through some quiz. We expect people to participate, and you can participate by dropping the right answer on the chat box. That will also help us to know that you've been following through with the training. So before we start the quiz, Before we start the quiz, we'll try and take one or two questions from the chat box. So let's go through the chat box and answer one or two questions. Then we can now take the quiz. Okay, we have a question. What common compliance mistake do organizations make that regulators often penalize during third-party breach investigation? So now, some businesses will onboard an entity, either an individual or a corporate entity, without validating if this entity has done audit filing or registration with the NDPC. That will be seen as an oversight, but that can pose significant risk to the business. So, as a data controller doing business in Nigeria, you want to ensure that your third parties are also registered the way your entity is registered. You want to validate if they've done that. You also want to be sure they file their audit returns through licensed data protection compliance organizations. Now, in the financial space, it is also required that before you onboard an entity, they also have some form of tax certificate clearance. So that will also be an oversight on your part if you don't do such due diligence. So there are certain metrics that you need to also ensure that you do. So I'm still going to take more questions. How can CISO and risk leaders effectively communicate third-party risks to the board in business impact terms? That's a very good question. Now, the board has a different approach when it comes to cybersecurity. If you'll be talking with your board, you need to look at what investments are they making? What return on investment are we expecting? So let me put it this way. If you are a CISO and you are telling the board to procure a software that can reduce unsolicited email, right? They may not understand what you mean because major board members don't have the time for you to come and be saying long things and because they have other priorities. Rather than go and explain to them, oh, let us get this software because it will do this, look at it from another angle. That if a staff, for example, click on a link and it leads to a fine from the regulatory body, it will affect their profitability. So you have changed the narrative. Rather than ask, you are not telling them that, oh, we could have shortfall in our profit. So they will pay attention because that's what they are more interested in, the profit margin. So when you are discussing with the board, you need to look at terms like what are we making from it in terms of return on investment? What might we lose in terms of sanctions and penalties? But when you are talking with staff, it's a different approach. You understand? So for board, try as much as possible to communicate in financial terms. What will be the return on investment and what will they lose if they don't do the right thing? So another question is, what are the security measures that should be expected from our third party provider as per core banking app? A very good security measure will be data encryption. Whether the data is on transit, whether the data is at rest, there should be evidence they have a software they are using to encrypt data. Also, data anonymization where applicable, data backup. not just in one location. There should be data backup in multiple locations. And you could also use cloud and on-premise. So that is something you should look at for your vendors. Yeah, the video will be available on YouTube once we are done with this training. And don't forget, there's also a session by 2 p.m. today. So after this session, there will be another session for 2 p.m. today. So this training will run till Saturday. So the calendar has been sent to your email and the dedicated WhatsApp group for the CISOs. Okay, someone is saying, can we get the slides for the training? Yes, you also get a mail on how you could have access to the slides and other materials. So you'll get a mail in that regard, and that will also be communicated on the WhatsApp group. So let us take some of the quiz and to validate our learning. So which statement best distinguishes third-party risk from fourth-party risk? Which statement best distinguishes third-party risk from fourth-party risk? So we have option A, option B, option C, and D. So you can either drop A, B, C, or D to validate if you understood this session. So I'm going to read the question. Which statement best distinguishes third-party risk from fourth-party risk? Option A says third-party risk relates to internal employee, while fourth-party risk relates to contractors. Option B says third-party risk arises from vendors with direct contract, while fourth-party risk arises from a vendor's subcontractors. Option C says third-party risks affect operations, while fourth-party risks affect only reputation. Option D says third-party risk is always technical, while fourth-party risk is always legal. So I've seen a couple of B, both capital B and small b. So let's see what the answer is. So the answer is B, because third-party risks arise from vendors with direct contract, while fourth-party risks arise from a vendor subcontractors. So we go to the next question. Why is fourth-party risk generally harder to manage than third-party risk? So if you know the answer, you can either drop option A, option B, C, or D. And there's a question here. What programs can CISO run to get certified? I guess that's what you're asking. So now, if you're a CISO and you operate in the financial space, the central bank has certifications you should have. Now, if you're a CISO in healthcare sectors, you also have certain certification you should have. So most times these certifications are industry based, but generally you have the um, CISM, you have the CCISO, and you have the, I know ISACA also has a certification, but you have the CCISO, which is offered by the EC Council. You have the CISM and you have the CISSP. Yes, you have the CISSP. So those are the certifications that are widely known for CISOs, and relatively CISSP is the most widely acceptable, most and widely acceptable, and the exam is the most difficult to attempt. So if you are looking at becoming certified, look at the CISSP, look at the CCISO and the CISM. Yes, those are the major ones. So let's see what the answer is to question two. The answer is C. Yes, C. Because organizations lack direct contractual and audit rights over fourth parties. So let us look at question three. Which of the following scenario best represent fourth party risk exposure? So you can either drop option A, B, C, or D. Okay, someone is asking, are we going to get evidence of attendance for sake of regulatory bodies? Yes, you will get that, but that will be communicated via email also. So the training is free, it will be on YouTube. But if you so wish to get the slides and certificates, that will also be communicated to your team on how to get it. So I'm getting C, C, C. So let's see if C is the answer. C is actually the answer because a payroll vendor hosting data in a foreign cloud data center. Okay. So the fourth question says, in vendor risk classification, a vendor that processes sensitive personal data, has privileged system access, and support mission critical operation should be classified as. Okay, we have option A, tier 4, option B, tier 3, option C, tier 2, and D, tier 1. So, what is the most appropriate answer? So, I see a lot of D. The answer is D, tier 1, critical and very high. So, from your feedback, it means you are paying attention, and this training will help you to be more effective as a CISO, because some of these things may be things you have not really taken time to address. So we have the fifth question, which is from a regulatory and reputational standpoint, how are third party data breaches most commonly viewed by regulators? So we have option A, option B, option C, and D. So the answer is C, as governance and oversight failures by the data controller. So if you have questions that we've not yet addressed, you could redrop them. But I think we've answered majorly all questions that have been dropped. So with that being said, we'll be back by 2 p.m. to look at the second module for the course. The slides will be sent, but a guide on how you could access it will also be dropped on your email after the 3-day program. So you'll get an email telling you on how you could access your slides. Also your certificates, because as an expert in cybersecurity, you ought to evidence that you go for trainings, and this training must not be physical training. There are virtual training that are as informative as physical trainings. So when you show regulators that you attend trainings and these trainings meet the regulatory need to perform your job, it is seen as you being effective. So that will also be communicated with your team on how to get a certificate for attending this training. So till we meet by 2 p.m., Thank you very much for joining us for this session, and keep learning cybersecurity to improve your business environment and your skills. Thank you very much.